Gee, Smalls. I suppose you don't even know who the babe is either. It's plug. What? Chewing tobacco?
Tobacco, man.
What do you do with it? You're killing me, Smalls.
Welcome back to Thinking Critical. This is Wes. In here, we talked about some of the issues as far as comic book art. We talked to Brett Smith well over a year ago. He came in and talked about how he got into the industry, how we kind of gotten where we are, and things that have been lost along the way. We've also talked about the way that comic book writing has changed. And in my opinion, it's fundamentally not as good as it used to be. So I wanted to bring in a professional just to kind of talk about the history of things, how people used to get in the industry, how they get in now. Obviously, here with me is Roland Mann from Silverline Comics, a longtime editor at a lot of publishers, longtime, professional in the comic book industry as far as writing and editing. How you doing, Roland?
I'm doing good. How about yourself?
I'm doing fantastic. Love talking about stuff like this.
My football team won yesterday, so I'm happy.
Well, congratulations. My football team did not make it.
Oh, sorry.
We fell to Kentucky. Oh, it's so embarrassing.
Oh, my goodness.
Yeah. What happened to Missouri football?
You're a Razorback fan, right?
Yeah, I know you're from Arkansas.
Right, yeah. We have a really good defensive coordinator now. He used to be a head coach at Missouri.
Oh yeah, that's it. He's not a great head coach, but he is a good. He's a
really good defensive coordinator. Sorry, absolutely. I didn't mean to make this comic conversation take a left turn here.
It's all good. The people will understand. So, Roland, back in the day, how did you get into comic books? Like, was there prerequisites that you had to fill? Were you just given an opportunity, or they're like, oh, Roland, you seem like a nice guy. Maybe you should write comics, or maybe you're an editor.
No, you had to work your way up. You had to. There were, obviously there's not one path into comics, and whether that be for art, writing, whatever. One tried and true way, obviously, was to get out there and make independent comics, make your own comics. Independent comics, I'm a huge advocate of independent comics today, but they've always been around. I mean, they've been around since, I didn't buy them as a kid because, it wasn't Spider-Man and Batman. And that was the same way for a lot of people, but they were always there. And so that is one tried and true path because, back in the day, Marvel and DC were the big leagues. If you wanted to, it's like if you played baseball, right? If you play baseball, where do you want to go? You want to go and you want to play for the St. Louis Cardinals, the New York Yankees. You want to play in the big leagues. And so what do? You play in high school, and then you go to college and you play in college, and then you hope you get drafted. But when you get drafted, you don't go immediately to the Cardinals. You go to the minor leagues, right? And so you go and spend time at, the Memphis Redbirds or the Daytona Tortugas. You spend time there, and then when the big leagues say, "Oh, we've got a hole to fill. We have a third baseman that we need," they look to the minor leagues and they pull somebody up. And it was very much the same way for Marvel and DC for a long time. It's like, those were the major leagues. If you wanted to make it in the major leagues, you had to prove yourself in the minor leagues first. And then they would look around and they'd say, there's this writer. He's been writing these independent comics that people like, and he's doing a good job telling good stories. I'm going to bring him up.
Mm-hmm. So you'd have to get noticed.
Yep.
I think back in maybe the 70s and 80s, they were called underground comics.
They were, yeah.
Yeah, because they certainly weren't available, everywhere. You had to know where to find them. And then, I imagine there's some type of talent development, right? You get in on a backup story, or maybe there's an anthology. You get a story here and there, and then you work with somebody, probably an editor that's been in there, and they help you, hone your craft and get better over time.
Yeah. One of my first, of course, I broke in the late 80s. One of my first published stories is a backup story in Nexus. A lot of people know Nexus, Mike Baron, Steve Rude, and I did a Judah the Hammer backup story in Nexus. I was this close to selling a Green Lantern story, and I had gone back and forth with the editor on my script probably about 4 or 5 times, something like that. And I thought I had just submitted my last revision to him, and I got hired by Malibu. And his response back to me was like, "Hey, I hear you got hired by Malibu. Congratulations and good luck." So,
that's the end of it.
Yeah, that was the end of that. So my Green Lantern story it never got sold or published. But I had gone around with the editor several times on revisions, and so yeah, there was a lot of in what he was doing with me. There was a lot of kind of training for what I had submitted to him. Now, another way that happened in particularly with Marvel and DC is you could get in at Marvel and DC on some other department. So you're not hired straight as a writer. They hire you as an intern or an editorial assistant or some other entry level position in the company. And then you get to know them and you get to understand how the system works and how to write stories. You become an assistant editor. You can
famously Ann Nesenti was, I believe,
Ann Nesenti,
their personal assistant, and then finally became an editor and then a writer.
Yes, yeah, and I'm a big fan of Nesenti's Daredevils. Yeah, so there's that way as well, and of course that helped. If you lived in New York City, I'm from Mississippi, so that wasn't, I wasn't going to move to New York City for some chance like that.
So back in the day, you would be identified as someone that is potential talent, to bring in, start developing them, show them the Marvel way, show them the DC way.
Right.
Not only do they have house styles for art, they have house styles for storytelling.
Mm-hmm.
It doesn't feel like there's really that anymore. With the level of competency that you see throughout the publishers these days, there are a lot of issues. The biggest one that I've seen, I know you've talked about it in the past, is decompressed storytelling or writing for the trades. When did you first start noticing that might become an issue, or even just all of a sudden was an issue?
I didn't really notice it until probably early 2000s. And I started wondering why I didn't like anything I was reading. I was like, why do I not like, because I was a Marvel zombie as a kid. I started reading, DC comics I read Teen Titans and something else. But I didn't start reading
superheroes.
Yeah, but I didn't start reading DC really until Crisis. I had problems with the multiverse, and of course now look what Marvel's doing, right? But I had big problems with the multiverse. I couldn't follow it. I'm like, I don't understand how there are 13 different Batmans. That doesn't, I can't follow that. And so when they had Crisis, that's when I jumped on. I bought a lot of DC comics then. So what was the question? Where was I going with that?
When did decompression, or writing for the trades really come into being an issue?
So I say all that to say, I've been reading Marvel and DC for a long time, and I liked them, right? But suddenly I'm finding myself, I don't like what they're doing here, or I'd read a comic and then I'm like, well, that didn't really accomplish anything. That didn't get me anywhere. And I didn't really know it was decompressed storytelling until I think someone came out and said, "Oh, this is decompressed storytelling." Blah blah blah. I'm like, "Oh, okay. Well, that makes sense." That was it. Yeah, I understand now why I don't like this, because it takes them too long. And now you've said writing for the trades, and I don't know that I agree that that's a problem. But I don't know that that's 100% the problem. I think what the larger problem is they're trying to write as if it's a TV show.
Famously, the 30 Days of Night movie, I think it was pitched as a script. It wasn't picked up. That the writer came into comic books, released it as a comic, and ended up getting more money when he sold the script back when it was a big hit. And it feels like people are trying to replicate that, not only with movies, but in television.
Right. And so part of the problem is, I think, in a television show, right, or any kind of moving pictures, when you write a script, you're writing it with the idea that the images move, okay? You don't write for a still shot. A panel is a still image. Yes, there's movement, and we can talk all about it, but it's a drawn image. It's a snapshot, right?
Mhm.
And in film and television, the images move. So when you write, so when you write your script, you write it for moving images. And what happens is you can include a lot of small details. John enters the room, he sits down his keys, he looks at his cell phone, he picks up the gun. And in film, you can kind of show all that, in one continuous, but in comics, you've got to show John enters the room, he sets down his keys, he picks up the phone, he punches in some buttons, he picks up the gun, right? These are all separate images. And the problem is, most of the times, we don't need to see all those. We don't. And I think writers have, younger writers, newer writers, or maybe even writers today, don't fully understand that they're writing for a comic book and not a television show. And I think for me, my argument is that, comics have always had, this has been one of the strengths of comics. We can do things that other entertainment media can't do. Here's another thing, and you don't know where you want to run with this, but thoughts, thought bubbles are becoming a bit passe because people, it's like, no, you don't understand. You can't do this in any other entertainment medium. You can't show two people in one panel and have, both of their thoughts in the same panel. You don't do that in novels. You don't do that in television. You can't do that in any other entertainment medium. Why would you get rid of it? Don't try to make your comic like a TV show. Make it like a comic.
But you're right. Thought bubbles are great, but now they've replaced, you had narration and you had thought bubbles, and they combined them two, and everything is first person narration from the point of view of the main character.
Yeah.
And you're taking away all this interesting information because you could get it told from a third perspective and then get inner monologue that would give you new information from the character's perspective.
Yeah, and that's what made us love the characters, because we knew the things that they were thinking. We knew the things that they were struggling with and having a hard time with. So as readers, it endeared us to the characters, and we don't get that anymore. We don't get that.
Well, it's crazy. You think about like the introduction of Spider-Man's origin story.
Yeah,
I believe originally it's like, is it 6 pages?
So like 6 or 8 pages, something like that. It's short.
Something like that.
Yeah.
When it was retold by Brian Michael Bendis, who a lot of people will credit for creating the writing for the trades model, it was 3 issues.
Right. Yeah.
6 pages, 60 or 70 pages.
It took him 60 pages. And see, I think it took him 60 pages to do what Stan Lee did in 6 or 8, whatever it was, right?
He and Ditko, yeah, absolutely.
So yeah, I think that there's that for me, that kind of encapsulates what the problem is. It's like, no, we don't need that much space. And you can say, well, Stan did it real quick, and okay, I get that. Maybe you want to expand it to an issue, but you don't need 60 pages to do what he did in 6.
Yeah, and there's other things that are being lost because of that. Yeah. And I do think the writing for the trades is also an issue, but I do think a lot of the comics we're reading are Netflix pitches, especially independent comics from like Image,
right?
Specifically. Yes. But Doc and I were talking about this. They almost don't have subplots anymore because you can't wrap up a subplot in one trade. Right. That thing could go on for 4 or 5 trades. Chris Claremont's subplot could last for 36 issues, 3 years, before he finally addressed it and it became the story.
Or he put it in there.
Almost eliminated subplots from the main story, so you're getting this really decompressed, boring story. I was reading Something Is Killing the Children, a comic book I like from James Tynion. The last 2 issues are 60 pages, and it's like 8 pages worth of story.
Wow.
And that obviously has been optioned. Right. It's going to be a streaming show somewhat soon. But there's a lot of writers like this, and then there's an entire generation of comic readers, and this is the comics they've been reading. They don't understand what we're talking about. It's like they used to, you'd read a 5-issue like overall story in Batman, and he might fight 4 main villains. Yeah, on the way to getting the resolution of in Jokerfish with Strange Apparitions. He ends up fighting 5 or 6 major villains. 2 enormous storylines are basically tied up by the end of that. That would take 2 years nowadays.
Right? Yeah,
literally.
Well, there's another thing I think that goes along with this, and it's page after page of panels or pages, excuse me, page after page of no text, right? I make the argument, okay, like here's the deal.
You can read a new comic in 10 to 15 minutes. You read a classic comic by one of the real quality writers, it's going to take you about 30.
Yes. And I make the argument, look, if your panel has no words in it, you've wasted my time and you've wasted story real estate. Okay. I have a friend, a good friend of mine, known for years, Barry Gregory. And so I steal this from him. He says a silent panel must scream. And I agree with that. If you're going to choose to have no words in this panel, that is a comic book that's meant to be
it's all
read,
on the artist.
It needs to scream. Don't give me 2 and 3 pages of, well, they're sneaking through here. I don't need to see all 3 pages of them sneaking through to understand that they're sneaking through. Show me one panel, get to the next thing, move your story forward. But
that's where Chris Claremont or John Byrne would have used those prose to tell you what happened in the meantime to get you to the next scene of action.
Right. And so layer it with something. I don't know, but it's frustrating to me as a reader to sit down and read a comic and be done in 5 minutes and go, wait, what? What? That's no.
I've read a couple of silent comics that I thought were really, really well done, and they were specifically written to be silent, and that's why they were supposed to be presented. But that should be an anomaly. That should be something you see once every 5 years, and it's like a cool story. Like, oh wow, look at what the art did. Is really neat.
I make people mad sometimes when I say, pictures without words are picture books, and I stopped reading those when I was 4.
You got a point there. Another thing that I've noticed that's missing, and I think you'll probably, as an editor, will have seen this even more drastically than I have. It feels like a lot of modern comic writers. First of all, I don't think they're comic writers for the most part. I agree with you. A lot of them are screenwriters or looking for television gigs. But even at that point, I think a lot of the people practicing their craft in comics aren't familiar with like 3-act story structure.
Right.
It feels like nothing ends.
Yeah.
And if it does end, it's not a clean ending. It's, you're just like the last 3 pages are the next story. And you're like, can I breathe here for a moment? Right, we just had a big moment. He just won the day. He almost died.
Well, yeah, let's go out for some shawarma. Right.
Let's play a little baseball or something.
Right. Yeah, I don't know where that comes from, because it's not like the 3-act structure is exclusive to any one medium.
It's the most tried and true method of presenting story.
It is
in the world.
It's the world. That's right. That's right. The Japanese have a little bit longer first act than we do. But yeah, it's still the same basic the structure. Yeah, I don't get that. That's another problem. And here's one of the ways that you can tell. Of course, I know you know this, but when you're reading a comic, and let's say it's just a standalone. It's a standalone 22-page comic. If you don't know what that story is about in 5 pages, they don't understand. The writer doesn't understand structure. Right? You need to know what that story is about right up front, right? You need to know where you are. You need to know the setting, right? Where you are, when you are, who this person is, what it is they want, right? And then you go, oh, cool. This is why I'm reading this, right? Because I'm going to watch this character do this thing. And then you get to watch them do it, right? Either they do it or they don't. But
they need to try.
Right. They got to try. Yeah. So,
it feels like that's been lost. Even like, nobody can end a comic book anymore, I almost feel like, because they make the threat so enormous that the actual hero himself could never overcome it. So you got to bring in some type of Deus Ex Machina or some type of other thing just all of a sudden magically appears, and that's what solves it for you. And it like the endings are kind of all deflating. It's like, that was it.
Yeah. Well, I don't know who. Someone where I teach. someone said this, and I don't know where this comes from, but this is another problem that I think kind of what you're touching on here is that your protagonist needs to protag, right? Your protagonist must protag. Yeah, I don't know where that comes from. I wish I could give attribution because I didn't make it up, but I love it, and that's exactly it. Your main character needs to be the one, driving the bus, telling the story, doing the thing. They don't.
And the villain should, in some way, be in direct opposition, whether it's power set, beliefs, motivations, something needs to stand directly in opposition of the hero for him to overcome. That's called conflict. Yes.
And that's what we want. That's what we want to see. We want to see conflict, right? Yeah. The
line between hero and villain is almost gray now. Everyone's half hero, half villain. Every villain's got like they're a hero on the inside. Who is it? Gail Simone says every villain is the hero of their own story. And like, sure, you can think about it like that, but that's not the way it goes out in the Batman story. I don't want to hear why, deep in his heart, Joker's just misunderstood, or there are times, Mr. Freeze, that one makes sense. Okay, you've got one character that's got a little moral component in there that you can sympathize with, but he is trying to freeze everyone to death.
But yes, he is, and that's just like saying, okay, well, you know what, Hitler was just misunderstood. No, the dude was evil.
Yeah.
He was evil and he had to be stopped.
Did you watch the MCU movies?
Yes.
So you saw Thanos in Infinity War.
Yeah.
In that movie, he's the protagonist. He wants to destroy half of the galaxy, and they presented him as the most sympathetic figure in the entire movie. And I believe there's only one character in one line, Doctor Strange, that says you're evil.
Yeah.
You can't do that.
That is evil. He's destroying half the people.
He's crying because he had to sacrifice his daughter. He didn't want to have to do that. He's doing it for everybody. I was like, it felt like the writers, and I'm a big fan of the Russo brothers, were on Thanos' side.
Yeah.
And we get a lot of that in comic books too.
Well, they may have been, and they may have been wanting to get rid of, the one half of the political spectrum.
Or the overpopulation or something like that. It's like, oh my goodness, this guy wants to murder everybody. He wants to murder half your family.
Yep.
For no reason. He doesn't even know him.
And you want me to be sympathetic with that person? I'm sorry. No, I'm not. Yeah. No, I think you're right. And I think that, I think if you want to tell the story, if you want to tell the story about Thanos, then call the movie Thanos, right? Mm-hmm. Don't call it Captain America, or don't call it the Avengers, because I am there to pull for Captain America. I am there to pull for the Avengers. That's, those are my heroes. That's who I'm going to go cheer for. And when you try to make Thanos, when you try to throw that in, I'm like, no, stop that. I don't want to sympathize with this guy because he's evil.
Yeah, I read a comic. It's called Thanos Rising. It's from Jason Aaron. It's supposed to be more of like a origin story for Thanos himself. And there are some sympathetic moments in Thanos's early days with his father and stuff. But even in that comic, for the most part, he's absolutely insane the entire time. He became insane at a young young age. He started seeing death and fell in love with her, even though he was a kid. And he was like the first person to murder somebody on Titan. Yeah. In 1,000 years, and he ends up, just murdering the galaxy. It's actually quite gruesome. I was like, well, that felt like a Thanos origin. He's absolutely atrocious.
Listen, evil people exist in the world, and they get there somehow. They get to be there somehow. And now I haven't done research on evil people in their early lives, but there are things that cause them to do that. I believe that. So, I don't have a problem saying this person is evil because his dad beat him repeatedly as a kid. Okay, yeah. Well, he's still evil, right? Yeah, that was a terrible situation, but he still went in and killed 50 people. That still makes him evil, Yeah,
and if that's going to be your villain, it should be somehow in direct opposition. Maybe the hero had a similar thing happen to him, but he turned out righteous. Right. And this is the worst thing that could have happened. That's why Batman has kind of a lot of heroes like that, and they make sense within him. Yeah. But I think the redeeming all of the villains, but also the deconstruction happening with the heroes, breaking them down obviously the Watchmen and Dark Knight Returns feels like they've had a massive effect on those kind of stories.
Well, and I think you're right. I think, and both of those came out in 1986. I think if you look, you had the Watchmen, Dark Knight Returns, you had Crisis, all of those in that year. I think that's kind of the year that you can point at. And I think people, they break comics down into ages, and I want to say that is one of the defining moments for the next age. I think the Image Age, something like that. But it really probably ought to be called the grim and gritty age, right? After that, because that's when things begin to really turn, and you begin to see all these characters become grim and gritty. So everybody wanted to do their Frank Miller,
and they still do, because this generation of writers have all been influenced by heavily by that. There's another writer out there that heavily influenced a lot of writers for a very good reason. We just talked about him on the channel this week. It was Denny O'Neil.
Oh, yeah.
Now, with his Speedy story, introducing the heroin addiction thing in there, we also got Demon in a Bottle, I believe, Tony Stark's addiction to alcohol. But he also, in his, Hard Traveling Heroes, started incorporating a lot more political and social conversations and ideologies of the heroes themselves. Right. One being Oliver Queen, the other being Hal Jordan, where they kind of work together, but were in direct opposition, of their kind of beliefs. I feel like that's also affected today's modern day writers, but they no longer show the heroes like working together. They've kind of just decided one side is right.
Yeah.
And when you do that, when you don't, and you're not Alan Moore, when you're writing Watchmen, which certainly has a lot of political thematic elements to it, but he presents them in a way. But now it almost feels like it's propaganda, and people hate when they hear that and when I say it. So they're always like, well, politics have always been in comics. Yes, there have always been some political messaging and a lot more social commentary in comics, but they've never been quite so heavy-handed and quite so one-sided as it feels like they've been for the last 15 years or so.
Yeah, well, I think you mentioned Denny O'Neil. I think there's a difference in this in the storytelling today, in that there's no balance. Yes. Because partly, so it's a little color thing. One color brings out the highlights of another color, right? So a darker color is going to look darker when you put it with a light color, and a light color is going to look lighter when you put a dark color next to it, right? And so this is one of the things that you can do when you're trying to show opposing ideas, right? And you but that creates the balance, right? So you have one character with this one idea, and then you have another character with a different idea, but you can't present one of them as nuts, right? Because then you're clearly, it's clearly not equal. Right?
Unless there's a villain, and then you have to take that idea and throw it so far out there that you can see what they think, but you can't relate to why they got there. Right.
Yeah. But what happens is when you look at something like Denny O'Neil and some of the older work, there is a balance there. So you can see, I understand what this guy's saying, but I also understand what this guy's saying. You can see some of that, because reality is most people kind of fall somewhere in the middle. And so when you have someone, say something from the left, and then someone say something from the right, generally they're going to say, okay, well, I can kind of see that point of view. But what's happened is it's become, I'm going to say this thing right here. Everybody who has this point of view is nuts. And so it becomes preaching. Okay. And no one wants to be preached to. I am a person of faith. But it doesn't take much to look at the church attendance in the last 20 years to see no one wants to be preached to, right? People don't go to churches anymore because they don't want to be preached to, right? And so it's the same for our stories. We don't want you, I don't care that you have a political opinion. I'm not buying your comic book because you have a political opinion. I'm buying your comic book because I want you to entertain me. Now, if you have a character in your comic book that has a political opinion, I don't really care, as long as it's part of your story. But the minute you start preaching to me and telling me that I must comply or I am evil, then okay, now you're preaching to me and I don't want to hear it.
So where do we lose the part of storycraft, or maybe the editorial oversight that says, I get what you're saying here, but you're not presenting it balanced, or perhaps I get what you're saying here, but we need to unbalance it even more and to get, this message across. Where did the editorial part about that get out of balance? Because I imagine, and from what I'm told, for the most part, comic book writers have always kind of been left leaning.
Yeah.
But they never really let it affect their work too much, and now it feels like it's dominating their work.
It's because well, for Marvel and DC, it's because the editors are spineless, or the editors are so on board with what they want, they're trying to say, they want to do it.
But at the expense of the characters or the popularity of the brand.
Well, here's the other thing, right? So when you look at editors from, you mentioned Denny O'Neil. When you look at editors from that day and age, they took it upon themselves to learn the character if they didn't already know. I mean, a lot of these guys who got hired were already fans. If you look at someone like Roy Thomas, who came on he was already a fan of comic books. Jim Shooter was already a fan of comics. He was
writing comics at 14.
He was writing comics. So when they come in, they already have a knowledge base of the comics.
Len Wein.
They're hiring people who don't know the first thing about comics now, right? Yeah. I had, so this is a real conversation I had with email with an editor of the Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles. Some years ago, not recently, but some years ago, I pitched the Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles, and I mentioned the toxic goo that dripped down into the right. I kid you not, the editor said, that's not, nor has it ever been, the history of the Turtles. And I'm like, I don't know what you're talking about, but you're wrong. And I didn't argue with them. I just said, okay, thank you, for reading but I'm like, what if number one, if you don't know that, what are you doing editing the Turtles? And so I think that's what's happened is Marvel and DC have gotten to the point now where they're hiring people who don't know the first thing about, Spider-Man or fill in the blank character. Now, again, Spider-Man was in the 1963. So you can't expect to hire a young editor who was there for it all, right? But you do expect to hire an editor who is familiar with and willing to go back and learn because all that stuff's available to them, right? They've got Absolutely. All of it's accessible to all of them. It's called work. Go back and read all the Spider-Man books. I don't care if Stan Lee's dialogue is a little dated. If you're going to edit Spider-Man, you need to read it all so you know.
Absolutely. That kind of leads us into the last thing I wanted to talk about, which also leads into the first thing we talked about initially, is we know that editorial right now, that's who makes the hiring ideas. So if you want to work on the Batman book, you got to go to Abernathy, the Batman group editor, and you get in there that way.
Right.
And so you're talking about, I'm not talking about Abernathy specifically, but we have these editors that have been, that are being hired in that, as you say, don't really know anything about comic books, let alone the actual characters. And then they're doing the hiring decisions for the comic books.
Yes.
Now, you would go in and pitch. You've talked about pitching stories a couple of times at some smaller publishers. But to do a Batman story or an Iron Man story, you would go pitch it, and then you would be accepted or rejected. They're going to take the best one that's for the character. They're like, okay, this has got a great 3-year arc. Let's do this. They don't do that anymore. Nobody's pitching anymore. They're almost being, do you have the right surface traits? Do you have the right sexuality? Do you have the right this that matches the character so we can get an authentic tale rather than the most amazing adventure, which is what comic books are supposed to be. Yeah. And there's no longer a ladder. You don't start out at, like you said, doing maybe some self-published comic books, getting up into an independent comic, maybe getting up into an IDW or a Dark Horse, some of the bigger indies, and then jumping up into Marvel, on a smaller character and moving up. It's almost like a pegboard. They're like, okay, you're a Black Panther writer because you're Ta-Nehisi Coates. You're this right here. And they're just pegged in there instead of earning their way up.
And he clearly doesn't know how to write comic books. Now, you can argue, he knows how to write political commentary. Okay, that's fine. That's not a comic book, right? Or he knows how to write novels. Okay, that's fine. That's not a comic book.
Write essays.
I'm going to give you an example, and I cannot say his name. I apologize. It's not my story to tell, but I'm going to let you know. So I have a good friend of mine, who's been a comic book artist for over 30 years, right? Mostly his work has been with DC. When the New 52 launched, I think he was doing a book, and he was 4 or 5 issues into it or something like that, and he and I were talking, and he's like, they're the worst. He's like, I've been drawing comic books for 30 years. He goes, these are the worst scripts I've ever had. I'm like, really? And he was like, yeah. And I'm like, so what, who is it? And he mentioned the person's name, and I didn't know the person. I said, well, why don't you say something to the editor? He goes, oh, I would never say something to the editor about this guy. And I'm like, why? He goes, because this writer has never written a comic book before, but he's an animation writer, and he's a friend of Paul Dini. Oh. So DC hires a writer who's never written a comic book before because he's a friend of Paul Dini. This artist friend of mine eventually quit because he said the scripts were just so bad he couldn't draw them, so he quit and went to do something else. But to me, that's a perfect example of part of the problem. Look, Paul Dini is, yeah, okay, I get that he does a lot of really good animation stuff, but he should know animation is different than comic books. And I'm not going to hire your animation writing friend just because he's your friend. Let him go do some independent comics. Let him figure out how to do it, and then we'll hire the guy, right? But great quote.
Right now at DC, they just brought in a ton of screenwriters from Supernatural and all these WB, CW type programs. I'm not interested and also in all from the animation industry all came in. And Infinite Frontier, some people like it. I think for the most part, it's crap.
So a fantastic quote from Bobby Chase. Okay. And I have her permission for this quote, right? I was talking to her one time about, because I teach comic book writing. So I was talking to her one time about students and their intern program. She was the one was in charge of the, DC runs this. I don't know if they still do it, but they used to. Every couple of years they would have this writer's workshop, right? Yeah, and so we're talking to her about that. And if you look at their requirements, it's like if you've not written a thing, we don't want you. We want the person who's been in the independent comics a while, because we want to take what you have figured out, and then we want to craft it and tone it and teach you how to make that step up to the big leagues, right? And I told her, I said, I had a student one time that told me he wasn't going to worry about doing independent comics. He was going to get his degree, and then he was going to just go work for DC. She said, let me make sure I get this right. DC is a destination and not an entry point for your comics writing career. And I went, wow, that's a great quote. And it's so true. But Bobby Chase isn't at DC anymore. Bobby Chase isn't at DC anymore. And it seems like other people are making these decisions now. So it's very unfortunate.
It's not comic book people is the problem.
It's not comic book people. Yeah. And I think for us who like comics, I think we see it and go, this is not a comic. Stop telling me your pilot, your TV pilot in a comic book, because I don't want to see that. If I want to watch TV, I'll watch TV. I want something to read that has pictures with it, right? I want novel
people. You can see writers dumbing down the script. You can see artists dumbing down the images because it's a proof of concept for a TV show, yes, and not the opportunity to tell the story of a lifetime with no budget, budget constraints, no special effects constraints. Go show the coolest story that you could ever do. Well, if I do that, they'll never be able to budget for it in the TV show. Let's break everything down. Let's make it look as least interesting as possible and as cheap as possible to produce on a soundstage.
Right. And part of that is, comparatively, comics are cheap to do. If you look now,
great marketing.
Now for someone like me and all those, all the people who make comic books, and that's what we do. It's like, okay, no, it's not cheap, right? It's not. But from the point of view of film and television, they look at it and it's like, oh, it costs that much to do a comic? Yeah, that's not a big deal. Let's do that, right? because it costs so much more to make television. And
yeah,
so
they're constantly paying people to write scripts that never get produced.
Yep.
Yeah.
So it's a shame because they'll toss that money at it and just produce crap. Where there's a lot of people in the independent market who are really trying to make good books and struggling financially to try to make it happen.
All right, Roland. Well, I know that you are the man behind Silverline Comics. I know you got a project that's actually going on right now on Indiegogo and Kickstarter at the same time. If other people out there and some of the viewers are saying, you know what, I've seen that problem. I want to read a good comic book that has good quality editorial, good quality storytelling behind it. What's this project all about, and when do they need to sign up?
Sure. This it's called Kayless, Kayless. Has nothing to do with Star Trek. Someone said something to me about that before, and I'm like, huh? I'm not a Star Trek. I like Star Trek. Don't get me wrong, but I'm not one of these guys that can quote all the episodes. Apparently, there was a Kayless spelt differently in Star Trek. Has nothing to do with Star Trek, but it is science fiction, action, a little bit of superhero in it. Basically, in the 1960s. The CIA sent astronauts into space and they lost them. Today, one of them fell back to Earth and he survived, totally unscathed, right? So the problem is he tries to seek out those who sent him up, no one will acknowledge his existence. And so he's trying to figure out what's going on with this secret project called Kayless. And there are people trying to stop him, and it's an exciting book. So
sounds like a little bit of Flight of the Navigator, a little bit of Bourne Identity in there.
A little bit of all kind of cool stuff. So this is our very first ever dual campaign. We're doing Kickstarter and we're doing Indiegogo. I've said before, I think we make comics that a lot of those that support Indiegogo books would like, because we're not agenda driven. We're just making comic books that have good stories. We're not agenda driven. We're not politically motivated with any of what we're doing. One way or the other, actually, we're just trying to tell good comics. So I do think there's a lot of the Indiegogo crowd who would be interested in it. Part of it is, I think it's raining like crazy. So I heard this sound. I'm like, what is that? That's rain coming down. So we funded the first 2 issues on Kickstarter. And we had issues 3 and 4 completely done. We're just kind of waiting for a slot to open up. And we decided, well, look, let's just go ahead and do them both. We'll do them both. So we're on Kickstarter because I can't really abandon all those. But we're actually already funded on Kickstarter. Mm-hmm. But we still haven't made our goal yet on Indiegogo. So on Indiegogo, you can get the trade, which is our Silverline's first ever trade to offer, which I'm excited about. It means we finally finished one of them. When we're close, we're like this close.
Were you writing for the trade on this one?
So I do miniseries, right? So I would love to do an ongoing series, but I just don't know that we're at that. Silverline is at that stage yet.
Crowdfunding is almost doesn't work. Like you got to do them in miniseries too.
Yes, yeah. So you can on Indiegogo you can either get the trade or you can get the 4 issues if you like the floppies better. And you can do the same thing on Kickstarter, but yeah. So if you're one of these who are like, oh, I don't care what platform I'm on, I'm encouraging you to go to Indiegogo, because we still need to we still have not reached our funding goal on Indiegogo yet. But if you're like, no, I'm only going to back on Kickstarter, that's fine. Please go to Kickstarter and consider backing it. It's a complete story. If you missed it, issues 1 and 2, if you're one of these that like, I'll wait for the trade, now is your time. You can get the trade and read the story in its entirety.
All right, Roland, I have heard through the grapevine that you did have an agenda with this story, and it was to entertain. So there you go.
Yeah, yes, that is my agenda, to entertain.
All right, Roland, I want to say thank you so much for coming on here, talking about kind of the atrophy and some of the changes that we've seen as far as getting into comics, the way that we've seen some degradation as far as using the medium not to its fullest, and some of the history behind that. And definitely congratulations on being fully funded on Kickstarter.
Thank you.
Hopefully you'll be funded very soon on Indiegogo as well. And we're definitely rooting for Silverline here. And I really appreciate you coming on here and talking with us.
Thank you for thinking about me. I love talking about comics, so anytime.